Building this railway in the 19th century was an exceptional achievement. What sets the White Pass apart is how quickly it was built. 2 short years. And where it was built, at high latitudes, in very cold weather. And talk about challenges. The White Pass needs 2,500 workers, but men quit constantly. It chews through tons of food, timbers, and explosives, fed by a supply line stretching 1,600 kilometers south. 7-meter snowdrifts and 40 below temperatures often bring construction to a halt. And it is built without the tools today's engineers take for granted. GPS, laser beam surveys, heavy equipment, and heavy lift choppers. So how did they build this railway in 1898? Easy. They built it by hand.
I think if you visualize 2 times during the year, you'll get an image of construction of this railroad. One is the image that's taken along the 7-mile cut. And they're probably in that photograph or somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 or 80 men, if you stop and start counting. Each of them moving rocks by hand with crowbars, tripled and quadrupled up trying to move a boulder with crowbars. All of it being done by hand. If you visualize all that going on, 2,000 men out there, manual labor, moving this grade and chiseling this railroad across the face of solid rock. Then visualize in February, 300-400 men, each of them with a snow shovel, trying to dig down to clear the line so that they can get the steam engine up the line to reach the summit for the construction project.
The White Pass is what they call a short-line railroad. It runs just 177 clicks from Skagway in the Alaskan Panhandle to Whitehorse. But it is a mega project. Built, they will say, with British financing, American engineering, and Canadian contracting. And its many big tests rolled into one. First, crews must blast their way through Rocky Point and explode sheer cliffs to get by slippery rock. They must cut through Tunnel Mountain, fashion a switchback to bypass Dead Horse Gulch, and then climb to the summit of the White Pass. The White Pass will cost $10 million, $1 billion today. It will be built in just 26 months. The story of the White Pass Railway starts in July 1897, when a coastal steamer pulls into Seattle. Hyped by the headlines of stacks of yellow metal and tales of dazzling riches, the stampede to the Klondike is on. The only problem is getting there. Hopping a steamer from Vancouver to Skagway is the easy part. But then the coastal mountains must be crossed, the Yukon River navigated to Whitehorse, then hundreds more miles trekked to the gold fields at Dawson City. The worst part of the trek to the Yukon is right at the start. 2 passes rise from Skagway's backyard, the White Pass and the Chilkoot Pass. Both are backbreakers. Each man, by law, must take a ton of supplies to the Yukon. Many lift it over the Chilkoot, 1 backpack at a time. The White Pass is longer than the Chilkoot, but not as steep. So there's a brisk trade in pack horses. 3,800 are driven to their deaths. A railroad could make a fortune hoisting men over these cruel passes. Investors from London are interested, but their man, Sir Thomas Tancred, has cold feet. Enter Michael J. Heaney. Heaney left home in the Ottawa Valley at 14, then worked his way up building the CPR in the Rockies. Now a seasoned hand, Heaney thinks a railroad can be built here. And as luck has it, a chance meeting in a saloon changes everything. Sir Thomas is leaving Skagway the next day. He's heard about Heaney and invites him for a drink. Heaney talks for an hour. He convinces Tancred he can build a railroad through the White Pass. Heaney's hired on the spot. 7 weeks after he's hired, Big Mike Heaney's crews start laying track in Skagway. It's June 1898. Now they're calling the boy contractor the Irish Prince. Heaney forges a tight bond with E.C. Hawkins, the chief construction engineer, and John Hislop from Galt, Ontario, the chief surveyor. Heaney, Hawkins, and Hislop, the three H's, as they're called, face the test of their lives. Their track must soar 873 meters over 32 kilometers, one of the steepest grades in the world. This is the toughest railway terrain anywhere, so the three H's are going narrow gauge. They're rail spaced 1 meter apart. What's the advantage over a wider gauge track? Narrow gauge means the rail beds can be narrower. That means a lot less blasting. And curves can be made tighter to hug the natural contours of the hills. Still, building the White Pass is a gamble. Look at Rocky Point. A sheer wall of granite running a half kilometer. Ask Ken Johnson about Rocky Point. He's the Edmonton engineer who got the White Pass recognized as an engineering icon of the 19th century.
Coming upon Rocky Point, it was a sheer cliff going down from the top right down to the Skagway River. And what they had to do was notch out a 15-foot wide area for the rail bed to go into.
Heaney's men drop in each shift at the end of ropes.
So in starting it, they had to have men rappel down from the top to actually get little footholds where they could start actually pounding in the holes for the black powder to blast. And of course, that was a very difficult thing. So they would start from the top and pound out little footholds and start blasting it down, 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 and all the rock was heading over into the Skagway River.
Drilling techniques are primitive. One man holds the drill bit and turns it a quarter turn every few blows as two other guys hit it with their hammers. That's double jacking. And just as amazing is the tale of how the black powder and everything else got up here in the first place. That's up to E.C. Hawkins, the railway's chief construction engineer. It's a lot of supplies. Example, the railway lays down 1,700 ties every kilometer. Each tie takes 4 spikes. That's 6,800 spikes per click. 225,000 spikes from Skagway all the way up to the summit. He's leapfrogging his crews. They're working on different sections. If one crew bogs down, say blasting, the other crews don't back up behind it. They leapfrog past the slowdown.
That became that easy way of advancing. They would bring it to a difficult section on the railway, and then they go down to the Bracket Road, take their crews and equipment that they had available, and then come back up to a difficult section and keep using that as much as they could.
Today, the entire route would be surveyed first. At the start, John Hislop sent out 5 survey crews. Ken Johnson started out as a surveyor's assistant. If he'd been a surveyor then, he'd have used this antique transit. He might have worked on one of those 5 crews.
And it's interesting that different survey crews had different opinions. Survey crews on the west side were coming through and saying this was the place you would have wanted to construct. Survey crews coming through and surveying the east side saying, no, this is better. This has a longer distance to go and a less steep grade coming up.
And by the first week of August, the railway's behind schedule. Heaney doesn't have enough men to stay on track. His workers keep quitting. The problem is, he's tapping a labor pool of stampeders.
They were not up here to make money building the railroad. Every one of these guys wanted to quit at the first opportunity so they could go stake a claim in the Klondike and become millionaires.
Heaney needs a workforce of 2,500 men. A gold strike nearby could be a problem. Most stampeders don't see a career in busting rock. Heaney and Hislop are on the grade when hundreds of their workers stream past them on their way to Atlan. The 3 H's can only regroup. Their biggest tests loom: slippery rock and the tunnel just beyond. Blasting crews will set off 450 tons of explosives between Skagway and the summit. You don't measure the rock they blast away in tons, you measure it in mountains. Slippery rock takes time, But the tunnel is a test.
After Rocky Point, it was a fairly easy construction coming up through Glacier and then up to Slippery Rock, which presented a similar problem to Rocky Point. Rock, steep slope, and having to cut a notch out. So that, again, presented all the same problems they had at Rocky Point. This time, they're now twice the distance from Skagway, so they had to haul all the stuff up on the Brackett's Road and continue the construction.
But Brackett's Road doesn't get all the way up here. And while railways normally deliver their own supplies, track hasn't been laid this far either.
The completed rail line was the supply line for the railway, so all the heavy things, such as rail, which is 56 pounds a foot, had to be brought in by train. There was no way that you could bring in this stuff in on Brackett's Road, so they were very limited as to what they would do.
And with no track up here yet, everything, anvils, powder, tents, tools, must be manhandled up a 300-meter slope.
If we look back 100 years, we would have seen probably a blacksmith shop up on top, and then the ropes that the workers were actually hanging down to do the drilling for the black powder. And then, of course, you'd see a bunch of activity coming up from the bottom as they were bringing up all the equipment that they actually would supply all the activity right there. I mean, this would have just been an anthill of activity from all sides.
Now it's September 1898, and after Slippery Rock, Heaney's nose to nose with Tunnel Mountain.
This is really the only tunnel that was constructed along the road, but they had this gap, this big trestle in between, that they couldn't build before they started drilling the tunnel.
Timbers for the trestle must come by train, but track doesn't reach this far.
They'd have to survey it in and be very, very sure they were starting at the right point, come in from the top, and bring the equipment in from the bottom and just start going at it. And again, this idea of starting from more than one point, they also started the other portal or the other entrance coming in from the other side, so they'd have the most efficiency and get it done as quickly as possible.
Work starts in autumn, but already winter's in the air. By November, temperatures drop to 40 below. Winds drive snow into 5-meter drifts. It takes 3 months to bore an 80-meter tunnel.
The darkness, your working efficiency goes down by about half, and then the cold reduces it to another half of that. So you're really working at about 25% of what you can do in the summer months.
Ken Johnson coined the phrase sourdough engineer to describe those who work north of 60. Engineering up here presents unique challenges: long supply lines, isolation, snow and ice. It is February 1899. Heaney is 5 months behind schedule.
Once the construction passed Slippery Rock and Tunnel Mountain, they hit the snow of White Pass Summit. And the snows up here can get in excess of 20 feet. So in other words, you're not spending resources now on constructing the railway, you're spending resources now on actually clearing it so the construction can continue.
Now half of Heaney's workforce is shoveling snow. More than 700 men clear thousands of cubic meters of snow and ice from the grade. Heaney lays track on top of the snow. The railbed can be reworked in spring, but Heaney can move forward now. Winter fights Heaney, Hawkins, and Hislop all the way.
They waged war on snow in building this railway. They also waged war on the ice. They first didn't know what to do. Nobody else had seemed to have had a model of how to build a railway on intermittent permafrost. Ultimately, what they did was they blew it out of the way with dynamite. But that was sort of improvisation, and that's an awful lot of what happened in building this railway. They came up with solutions for each of the situations they came across that looked extreme and almost impossible to any observer, whether informed or not.
Back in April 1899, the investors have hatched a plan to push track all the way to Whitehorse. Nervous over towering costs, they'll build the final section in stages. First, a 32-kilometer leg will be built from the summit to Bennett, BC. Then, a 70-click leg from Carcross to Whitehorse. But how will this 43-kilometer gap in the middle be bridged? With riverboats and ice sleighs for now, connecting to another train to Whitehorse. Back on the grade, Heaney's leapfrogging again. He reaches Bennett in July 1899, 13 months after starting in Skagway. That makes the White Pass a going concern.
When the railroad reached Bennett, essentially, they were now able to start working the White Pass and Yukon route, which was, of course, the system, the routing, the bringing of passengers and freight from Tidewater through into the Yukon and back again. The White Pass route was the thing that they could sell, and that's where the freight rates could become interconnected with the riverboat traffic. They were able to buy up the riverboats on the upper river. There was a tremendous buccaneering spirit in the early days. I mean, the riverboats putting each other out of business, lower and lower rates. White Pass solved the problems by buying up all the riverboats. They therefore then consolidated into a monopoly on the rivers as well.
In late August, 14 months into the project, crews start building the new leg to Whitehorse. Then they make a mammoth mistake. It's a flood of near biblical proportions. A century ago, Lewis Lake was above Ken Johnson's head, but the railway accidentally lowers it 20 meters. There's still much to learn working north of 60. The villain is permafrost.
What happened when they started digging the channel is that they encountered permafrost soils, which have ice in amongst the soil. And what happens when water flows through permafrost is it starts digging deeper and deeper. What they ended up with was a channel that was probably 6 or 7 meters deep, lowering the water level to where we are now, and created a situation where they had a much bigger construction enterprise to finish the project around Lewis Lake.
With winter fast approaching, Heaney must build 2 180-meter spans across Lewis Lake. If the bridges aren't built, his supply line, the railway, will lurch to a stop. Luckily, new supplies arrive in time. The 43-kilometer gap that runs the length of Lake Bennett is next. But blasting these cuts out of solid rock makes one 11-click section the most costly stretch along the entire route. By spring of 1900, Heaney's work gangs are making the final push to Whitehorse. The last spike is driven on July 29, 1900, 26 months after the first is driven in Skagway. Big Mike Heaney leaves Alaska 3 days later. The railroad is done. And overnight, so's the gold rush.
That is the ultimate irony of the White Pass and Yukon, is that just as the rails reach Whitehorse, they have their Golden Spike ceremony at Carcross in the Yukon Territory, finishing a 110.7-mile long railway line. I mean, now you have a link from Tidewater to the headwaters of navigation on the Yukon River, and just as this is finished, the Klondike Gold Rush is over. I mean, there is a gold rush downriver at Nome, and everybody's charged off, leaving Dawson City, pretty much to the miners and to the corporate mining interests, which consolidate buying out on the creeks, the individual prospector, bring in the giant gold dredges, and of course begin the methodical process of dredging out the Klondike River valleys.
The White Pass is adaptable. It hauls ore and helps develop Yukon mining. In World War II, the U.S. Army commandeers it to help build the Alaska Highway. In the 1950s, the White Pass pioneers containerized shipping. In 1982, it shuts down. The White Pass is reopened in 1988. The Klondike Gold Rush might be long over, but there's still gold in them thar hills. As Soapy Smith might say.
Yeah, it's much easier to dig the gold out of tourist pockets than it is to dig it out of the ground.
Today, the White Pass hauls 400,000 tourists a year, far more than the total number of stampeders it ever carried. They said the White Pass couldn't be built, but it was. In all, 35,000 workers toiled in these hills. They worked with what they had, their wits, their grit, their guts, and sheer will. And a century later, the toughest little railway ever built, the White Pass and Yukon route, is still chugging up these slopes and still running strong.